Hello, I'm Mark Holloway, and this video is what I'm calling my DIY English Toolkit. Now, DIY stands for do it yourself. Nobody can learn a language for you, you have to do it yourself. I've been a language teacher for over 20 years, but I would say a better name for what I do is that I help people to learn languages. Because you only learn a language by doing it yourself. The purpose of this video is to talk about some of the basic tools we need when learning English, or at least improving our English. Now, I've spoken about DIY. I'm not very good at DIY around the house. I'm quite clumsy, and I guess I'm not very good with tools. Here's a tool for DIY. It's probably the only tool I'm any good at in DIY. I'm useless with everything else. Now, to follow any of my videos about developing your language skills, you'll need to understand a few important terms that I use. So think of your understanding of these terms as a toolkit for improving your English, and consider this video to be an introduction to that toolkit. So we're going to talk about four basic tools, four basic ideas that I think we always need to be looking at and thinking about in order to understand and communicate effectively in English. And those are, we're going to talk about verb phrases, noun phrases, patterns, and sentence structure. I'm joined by my dog, who is popping up every now and again in the corner. There she is, and she's very happy to see. Okay. Everything I say is, or the examples I'm going to use to explain these basic tools revolve around two sentences from novels written in English. The first sentence is the famous opening sentence to George Orwell's novel 1984, which reads as follows: "It was a bright day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Okay. Another sentence we're going to look at is from a more difficult novel to read. It's from Ulysses by James Joyce, and the sentence is, "Love loves to love love." Okay. I hope you're intrigued. So, it was a bright day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Let's use this sentence to think about verb phrases. We've got two verb phrases in this sentence. We've got was and were striking. So it was a bright day in April, that's the past form of be, and the clocks were striking 13. So that's the past progressive form of the verb strike. Now, notice I'm using the term verb phrases because sometimes verb phrases involve more than one word. So in our first example, we've got just one verb, be, and in the second we've got two words, which are an auxiliary verb, were, and striking, which is our main verb. And the verb phrase obviously contains a verb, and it gives us information about whether this verb happened in the past or in the present, and it tells us something about maybe the way that it happened as well. Now, noun phrases. It was a bright day in April and the clocks were striking 13 contains three noun phrases. The first is a bright day in April, the second is the clocks, and the third is 13. 13 is a little bit strange because we don't usually talk about the time being 13, and that's a kind of beautiful thing about this first sentence of a novel. It's short and it's simple, but it immediately tells the reader, you are in an unfamiliar society. You are the novel is taking place in a world that is a little bit different to your own, because they talk about 13 as a time and not 12, 1, 11. Okay. Three noun phrases here, and I think it's important to know that every noun phrase contains a head noun. So in the noun phrase a bright day in April, the head noun here is day. So the most important kind of detail here is that it was a day, and the word bright describes the day, and in April tells us something about when the day was. So the most important word, the head noun, the one that signifies what we're talking about here, is day. And of course, with our other sentences, with our other noun phrases, the head nouns are clocks and 13, because there's only one word. So we've spoken about verb phrases and noun phrases, and now I'd like to talk about patterns. Okay, I don't think there are many kind of grammar books out there that talk about patterns, but I think it's actually really useful to think about language in terms of the patterns we encounter, and the patterns that are actually quite predictable when we're learning and using a particular language. And it might help us make sense of an expression like a clock strikes, or we might meet an expression somewhere, the clock struck 1 or the clock struck 2. This is an example of collocation. Collocation is about words that frequently appear together in the same location or near one another, and when we're talking about the time or something that a clock does, it's quite a common collocation to use the verb strike with the noun clock. When we talk about the clock struck 1, clock struck 2. Quite unusual. It would be quite unusual to use this in the present tense. So, the clock is striking 3. You have to say that at the moment between the 3 bong, bong, bongs. So we see it at the start of 1984, and it's not unusual in a narrative. So it's not unusual in a sentence, in a story. It's quite an interesting and poetic way of reporting the time. So the clock, instead of saying it was 1 o'clock, we can say the clock struck 1. Instead of it was 12 o'clock, the clock was striking 12. It's a bit more natural. Clock was striking 12 because of the time it takes for clocks to strike 12 times. You have this sense of, that's an action in progress, or it's an action that's perhaps not finished at the time that we're reporting. However, we've already said that it's quite unusual to say the clock was striking 13. However, it makes sense to an English speaker, because we know to expect, when we've seen the word clock and strike, what comes next will be the hour. It will be a number, and usually that's a number between 1 and 12, but 1984 starts with the surprising number 13. Now, this is collocation, and it's about kind of vocabulary patterns. But there is also a kind of grammar pattern in here, and I'm going to say more about this in relation to our other sentence. But when we talk about clocks striking, we can't just say the clock struck, okay, and finish there. Now, when I was 9 years old, my school football team couldn't play regularly because the teachers were striking. So the teachers were refusing to do kind of extra work outside of their regular teaching because they were trying to get better pay, better working conditions. They were on strike. They were taking industrial action. So that's one meaning of the word strike. And when we use the word strike in that sense, it's what we call an intransitive verb. That means there's no object that follows it. The teachers were striking. It wouldn't make sense to say the teachers were striking 6, or certainly not the teachers were striking 13. When we talk about the time, and clocks striking, that meaning of strike is what we call transitive. Okay, so there must be an object that follows it. So strike might seem like a very simple word to learn. It's certainly a simple word to say and to spell, but in order to use it correctly, we have to understand it has different meanings and different patterns of use. And the pattern of use here is not just about vocabulary, but it's also about grammar. It's about the type of word that can follow and the fact that a word, a noun phrase, has to follow. Perhaps it's a vocabulary issue that noun phrase is always a number. It's also common sense given we're talking about time. Okay. So if collocation is about vocabulary, then colligation is about grammar. And often vocabulary and grammar mix together in English and in any language. So examples of colligation in our sentence here is that we say a bright day in April. So if we're talking about a day and a month, then the word we use to link them is in. We don't say a bright day on April. We don't say a bright day at April. I could suggest different meanings of the words in, on, or at, but perhaps it's just easier to learn that there's a pattern. And then when we say a day, we'll say a day in August, a day in September, a day in summer, a day in spring, and not on or at. What about this? Love loves to love love. There's another nice, I think, example of colligation here, and that's when we use the word love, it can be followed by a noun phrase, which would normally be like a person or an activity. So here's my dog. I love. Sorry, I love. She looks surprised. She doesn't like looking at the camera. I love my dog. I love Cookie. There's an anniversary card behind us that says I love you. We know those expressions, but we can also say I love to. Like I love to move it. This sentence from James Joyce: love loves to love love. Love loves to love. That's colligation. I can say I love to cook. I love to spend time with my family. You love to see it is a common expression of satisfaction at the moment among football supporters. It's been some time since I've been able to say you love to see it about anything happening with my football team. Okay, so we've looked at verb phrases, noun phrases, and patterns. Also important to understand something about sentence structure, and the most basic thing in sentence structure in English is within any sentence we should hopefully be able to identify a subject and a verb, or a subject or a verb. We might be able to identify an object as well, and like this sentence, love loves to love love, seems really strange, but if we stop and think, okay, is there a subject here? Is there a verb? Is there an object? Once we work out what the subject, verb, and object is, it will make sense. So again, if I can point properly, okay, the card above me that says I love you. Subject is I, love is the verb, you is the object. So in our sentence from Ulysses, love is the subject, love is the object, and loves to love is the verb phrase. Love loves to love love. Go back to 1984. The clocks were striking 13. The clocks is the subject, where striking is the verb phrase, and 13 is the object. And all I want to say here is that I think a basic tool for analysing and developing your English is the ability to identify in a sentence what's the subject, what's the verb, and if there is one, what's the object. Okay? And those are our four kind of basic issues. So if you want to kind of follow my videos and understand some of the things that I'm referring to, it's really important that we know what verb phrases are, what noun phrases are, what patterns and sentence structures are. If you have any questions, please do ask. You can respond with a question, a comment, point out anything that is not clear, and I can try to make it better. Thank you very much for listening.